Well, hello there and welcome back. Last week we introduced a new format exploring the idea of independent investigation of truth and the need to use wisdom to swim counter to the current of contemporary thought. Tonight, we're going to look at a biblical perspective which both supports this idea and, as we'll discover, flips it on its head to a degree. Join us as we continue to explore the role of religion in society on Created in the Image of God. First, let's meet tonight's special guest, Gerry Tostowaryk, also known as Dry Toast, and I think we'll see why as we progress into this show. He is the host of The Fact of the Matter, a weekly podcast that looks at history, society, and culture. Gerry's podcast searches for the facts behind famous situations, both current and historical, especially those involving religion, science, historic events, and philosophy. As a longtime instructor in ethics for the real estate industry, Gerry has studied and pondered the field of ethics for many years. Gerry, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Well, we're glad to have you. And as an opening, we wanted to have you share the nutshell of your upbringing, basically the first 14 years of your life, those formative experiences that shaped you and molded you into who you are today.
Okay. Well, I guess the first 14 years of my life are what I would call extraordinarily ordinary. I was born into a working class family in a working class town, Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And really, I was blissfully unaware of the goings on in our world. And first 14 years, I really had no direction, no cares in the world. Even the day we landed on the moon, I was actually out going to my friend's place to see if he could come out to play with me because we were just a kid at the time. And I wouldn't have known, I wouldn't have seen it if his parents hadn't have said, get in and sit down. We're watching the moon landings. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had a clue about it. Um, I was, and I still am, I guess, the black sheep of my family. There were six children. My sister was the oldest, and I was the oldest. I was after her. I was the next oldest of five boys. So it was my sister and five of us boys. And I guess probably a life shaping event in the first 14 years of my life was when I was in grade three. The family moved, and I went from the old school where everything was fine and I moved to a new school where I kind of never really fit in with the crowd in that new school. For whatever reason. And so that's the first 14 years of my life in a minute or less.
Yeah, well, having shared that, and maybe there's more in that when things started to shift a little bit for you when you moved. But we were wondering how those experiences have shaped your view on personal responsibility, sort of coming from the assumption that, once you're 15, you start to be more responsible for your choices and actions in the world. So, to be more clear about my question, how the concept of taking personal responsibility has shaped you today.
Okay. Well, I guess I'm again maybe that exception to the rule. Personal responsibility never really hit me until later on in life, and it didn't really begin. I guess in my from starting at 15 when apparently the concept of personality kicks in. It never really kicked in for me until I was 21. I met my then wife to be, and we just celebrated 40 years of marriage. So
Congratulations.
I guess that's kind of one of those things in life. That's so around 21 is when the thought of personal responsibility really began to kick in for me. So it's kind of a non-answer to your question, but the first 14 years really didn't really didn't add to my concept of personal responsibility. I was rather irresponsible.
Sure, and I understand that, as I think we all all were. Um, and but now you seem to be a very active agent in the world, with your podcast and your teachings on ethics and stuff. So, like, how do you merge that idea of personal responsibility with, what you do in the world now? You're really taking action on things. So sort of moving the things that need to be moved. So, can you talk a little bit about just how that is tied in with, you know, perhaps some of your formative experiences, and then now what you're doing to take responsibility for things you see in the world that need someone to take responsibility for them?
Okay, absolutely. You know, I guess I guess for me, probably my formative years, actually, those early years maybe served for me as something to move away from, and um, uh, maybe to expand a bit. The becoming an instructor for the real estate industry in the field of ethics, studying ethics over a number of years. When you study ethics, you can't help but get steeped in philosophy and learning all the good things in life, I guess. And so, what really, how would I word it? When I need to move those things that need to be moved, I want to refer back to in my early 30s, I stumbled across a book called Four Reasonable Men by Dr. Brand Blanchard. And while I didn't agree entirely with him and with the four folks he chose about as examples of reasonableness, nonetheless, the concept of reasonableness really hit me and struck me and stayed with me. And then as I learned about ethics and philosophy, what I guess what do I use to move those things to be moved? The If we take a very short definition of ethics, it's what we have a right to do versus the right thing to do. And so I really try when there's a decision in front of me or something I have to do, I try and say what's the right thing to do. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, absolutely, and just the work that you're doing in general. I think Wade will take it from here.
Hey there. Sorry, I was just futzing with the controls here. Thank you so much, Jacqueline and Gerry, for introducing and warming up the show and the audience. We're going to dive now into the topic tonight. So, the Apostle Paul, in his epistle to Timothy, gives us this interesting soundbite, a little bit controversial, and it's therefore it's useful for the show and to get interest. So, that soundbite is science falsely so called. Now, the word science is translated, or the word that gives us that word science, uh, it's only translated science twice in the entire Bible, 66 books. The word science appears twice in the King James Version. So we're going to spend a minute looking at that quote so that our audience understands, especially if there are any textual critics or biblical scholars in the audience, so that we're not in any way misrepresenting or abusing this soundbite. But I want to just read, first of all, this first quote from 1 Timothy chapter 6. And Paul is referring to his young disciple Timothy and warning him. He says, "O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science, falsely so called, which some professing have erred concerning the faith." Now, that word science will be translated differently in other translations, perhaps as knowledge. We'll get into that in a minute. But first of all, the word that is used is, and I have done some rudimentary study of Hebrew. I'm by no means, an expert in pronunciation and whatnot, but it's madah, madah, And it's translated 4 times as knowledge, once as thought, and once as science uh, in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, the one that Timothy uses, it's actually the Greek word gnosis. The Greek word gnosis is translated as knowledge 28 times in the New Testament and as science only once. So let's first read the Old Testament instance of the word science, and then we'll come back to this quote by Timothy. In the Old Testament, the book of Daniel, we read, "And the king spoke unto Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel." The king here is Nebuchadnezzar, and it's the book of Daniel, and Daniel was one of these children. "And he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, well favored and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans." So here the word is used in a very positive manner, right? King Nebuchadnezzar wanted to assemble some of the best and brightest from among those people whom he had conquered and captured, if you will, and bring them into his household and invite them to serve, so that he would, encourage this wisdom, this knowledge to grow up in and around the palace. And Daniel was one of the ones chosen. So here we see a very positive use of the term science, and I want to emphasize that before we go back to the other one, lest anyone think the Bible is anti-science, lest anyone think that people who believe in the Bible have somehow find evidence in the Bible that helps them become science deniers. For those who watch this show, they know we are anything but science deniers on this show, right? So I wanted to read that from the Old Testament. But getting back to what Paul said, given that background, and Paul was a scholar, Paul was an exceedingly bright and brilliant man for his time, and well versed in multiple languages. And yet he then flips this on its head and says science, falsely so called. Now we've got to spend a minute on gnosis and Gnosticism, right? Gnosis, the word means knowledge, and it's related to the term Gnosticism. And many scholars believe that this is what Paul was getting at, that he was combating Gnosticism, right? So they would tend to dismiss the point that I'm trying to make here by saying, well, it really has nothing to do with knowledge. It really has nothing to do with wisdom and science. It's strictly Paul combating this wrong theological argument. Let's quickly read from gotquestions.org a definition and a statement about Gnosticism. The definition of the word Gnostic is about as easy to nail down as a flopping fish. It is derived from the Greek word gnosis, meaning to know. In the case of Gnosticism, what is known has shifted over the thousands of years since Gnosticism first reared its head during the formation and solidification of the early church. Right. So Paul was a contemporary of the disciples. He came on the biblical scene right after Jesus' crucifixion. He was not involved in the later consolidation of the church, during which this Gnosticism arose and was identified. Again, my point is it's not this, but I want to just quickly cover what you'll read about Gnosticism. Basically, the Gnostic believes in acquiring special mystical knowledge as the means for salvation. According to Gnostic beliefs, there is a great God that is good and perfect, but impersonal and unknowable. The creator of the universe was actually a lesser deity, a cheap knockoff of the true God, who wanted to create a flawless material universe but botched the job. Instead of having a utopia, we ended up with a world infected with pain, misery, and intellectual and spiritual blindness. All matter is now corrupt and evil. However, when this lesser deity created man, he accidentally imbued humanity with a spark of the true God spirit, making man an inherently good soul trapped in the confines of an evil material body. So getting back to what Paul was actually saying, it's my position here that he wasn't addressing any of that. Paul was a scholar. in the Old Testament, which was the Bible at that time. He knew all about the Garden of Eden and the story there and how that is represented. We've covered that many times on this show about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and that God knew and intended that man would search his own way and would have to use human reason. Paul spoke elsewhere about people who were mature and who, by reason of use, exercised their senses to discern good and evil. And this is in a sense the basic of scientific inquiry, right? We explore that which is around us using our senses. We form hypotheses, we come to conclusions. So what was Paul referring to if it wasn't Gnosticism? Well, my position is this, and this weaves into the whole theme of the show, and we'll get back to Gerry in a minute here and ask him to, comment on this from the perspective of the work that he's doing with his podcast. And it is this, that throughout the Bible, the 66 books, we see this progression of revelation. God is constantly sharing new information with his creation. When humankind in the Garden of Eden determined to take for themselves the prerogative of understanding good and bad, evil and truth, just instead of just following, you might say in blind faith, what God told them, they set out on a path of inquiry and reaching their own conclusions. And they experienced no end of problems and challenges as represented in the words of the Bible and in our own human experience. And God continually gives them additional insight, additional teaching, additional knowledge, referring them back to what was already said, but also updating it and explaining it in the context of a growing world, right? Where you went from just families to tribes, to city states, to later empires, and today's complex world in which we live. My point is this: I believe what Paul was talking about can be easily described by just getting out on the limbs of the tree, moving too far away from what we could easily call the trunk of the tree, the knowledge that is grounded in the revealed word of God. We should absolutely be pursuing scientific inquiry. We have chosen the path from the dawn of human history of scientific inquiry, of finding out for ourselves the difference between good and evil. But there is divine input available. This is what Paul was referring to. As we pursue scientific inquiry, we should always be going back to the bedrock of revealed knowledge from the divine creator who's given us a handbook, who's given us guidance, and we can check back in as we're exploring and learning and growing. And Paul was simply warning Timothy to not get too far out on the limb, to check back in both morally, ethically, with what he already knew and understood. So that's the position that I'm taking on this verse. Gerry, I've sort of held forth now and explained my perspective. What are your thoughts? What's your reaction to all of this?
Oh, I need about an hour or two. There's so
Well,
wow.
you've got 10, 20 minutes at least here. So
Okay, there's so much in what you've just said. So much. I'm struggling with where to start, but let me start by answering the question maybe in the simplest manner. And again, where I come from, especially with my podcast, is I try and take myself out of the equation. I try and come at the 30,000-foot view and look at all the evidence and everything and where it leads. And so this to me, the simple answer is there should be absolutely no friction between religion and science. Why do I say that? Well, okay, let's make the assumption there's a God, and this God created the universe and all of us. Well, then what's to be afraid of science? It's all been created by the creator of the universe. So what's to be afraid? What's it gonna, so there's nothing to be afraid of there. And I believe the Catholic Church is also very strong in the fact that whatever science finds, they find. In fact, some of the listeners may or may not know, but the Catholic Church, I think it was around 1100, started the university system we have today, and they created the system that is our universities today, our university system. So they very much were in favor of promoting what the sciences. In fact, one of the podcasts I did, well, it was a 2 or 3 part series. I did one on Galileo in the Catholic Church, and what really happened. We delved into the facts behind that, and that's an interesting one. In a nutshell, they were not against the science of it all. So there's the short
Yeah.
answer.
And perhaps I'd invite you to just unpack that for a moment, because the common conception around Galileo and Copernicus is that the Catholic Church was trying to squelch knowledge and trying to shut up both Galileo and Copernicus, and obviously that's, from your perspective, not entirely accurate. So unpack that a little bit for us.
Sure. Okay. Well, for example, so Galileo was promoting the Copernican theory, that everything revolves around, we all revolve around the sun. The sun, not around nothing. Everything doesn't revolve around the Earth. Geocentric versus heliocentric. And Copernicus never got in any trouble. Nobody ever came after Copernicus, the one who started the theory. And so what happened? What happened was, I wasn't there, but just based on the research. The Catholic Church was actually funding Galileo. They were funding his research but at that point in time, most of the scientists still believed that everything revolved around the Earth. And with the crude instruments they had at the time, and not realizing just how far away the stars really are, they were misreading the evidence. Anyways, most of the scientists believed that everything revolved around the Earth, and Galileo saying, "By golly, I've got some evidence here that no, that's not. Everything revolves around the sun." And so Galileo, the church had a day of. They actually had a day of celebration in Galileo's honor, and a lot of the Jesuits who were big into science. They were coming up to Galileo and they were saying, "We're finding the same evidence as you. We weren't sure what to make of this." But Galileo was quite a character, and he was a little big for his britches, and he was a bristly kind of a guy. And as always is the case, there's always someone behind the scenes saying, "You should do this, you should do that." And Galileo was all ready to do it, and so he wrote a book and he ridiculed the Pope. He made this dunce. There was this dunce in the book, and the dunce asked him the same questions that the Pope had been asking him. And so he was irritating the Pope, and the Pope says, "Okay, you want to play, we'll play." And, so he was irritating a lot of scientists. He was irritating the Pope. And they basically, in a nutshell, they said to him, "Look, you can't be going out and saying your theory is a fact and everybody else is an idiot." In a nutshell, that's kind of what happened. And he was quite an irascible fellow. And it was quite an interesting story, actually. So that's in a nutshell. And so, but why I feel there's no tension, or should be no tension, between religion and science is they're both, in a nutshell, they're both a search for truth. Science is a search for truth using empirical data, using evidence, and theology, philosophy, search for meaning, and what there is to the universe, where it comes from, why are we here, right? The big question. And so really, what's the tension? We're both searching for truth. I think where the tension comes from on both sides is sometimes the problem is not science and the problem is not religion. I think the problem is us. Let's say I'm a scientist and I believe in science, and I'm an atheist, and we see from the science side. We'll go to the science side first. We'll pick on the bad guys first. We go to the science side first, and we see, to this day, scientists using their position as a scientist to promote their position as an atheist. They're crossing lines there. We're also seeing theologians using their position as a theologian to push their views as a what would you call it, a religious, as a pastor, to say no, science is wrong and the Bible is right, and never the two paths shall cross. I see us as as always, right? Human beings are the problem. We abuse our field of study, if that's a good way of saying it. We, you know,
Yeah,
oh,
I'd like to invoke a term that's common today: echo chambers. So between religion and science, there have been massive echo chambers that you know were dominant for centuries. And I'd like to refer, for those students of the Bible, I know we had one comment where someone doesn't want us to spend time in the Bible, but we're on both sides of this issue. So if you want to engage in this conversation, you're going to need to be a little bit familiar with both. There are tens of millions of people, perhaps even 100 million or so in America, who even today still identify as Christian. We'll get into that in a minute. But to be conversant in these topics, I would encourage everybody to be willing to listen a little bit to both sides. What I want to use as an example from the pages of the Bible, which speaks against astrology, right? There are verses in the Bible that talk about dealing harshly with those who are into astrology. This, of course, can get carried over by religious people and misinterpreted. But again, from the perspective of continuing revelation or progressive revelation, what happens over time is these echo chambers evolve. And this, the scientists of one era are the, stupid quacks of another area. And we tend to look back and sit in judgment of what went before us. But, time is a moving stream. The Bible covers thousands of years of history. So imagine that creator that you referenced, and I agree 100%. There is a creator, and the universe and everything we can perceive with our senses is his revelation. The creation is, in fact, a revelation of higher principles. What did Einstein say? I want to know God's thoughts. He viewed things from that perspective. The universe is, in fact, a revelation of higher principles and also, quantum information, right? My point being this: the creator of all this recorded through probably verbal stories going way back those first few verses about the creation. And people want to look at them and say, well, they're not scientifically accurate. I look at them and I find scientific accuracy within them. I find that God reveals himself to be the creator of time and space, and he even says that in those first few verses of the Bible. He says that God put the greater and lesser light in heaven to create signs, seasons, days, and basically time, right? So the movement of the bodies is revealed in the first few verses of Genesis as creating space time. It's right there. Other aspects of it would seem very unscientific. But so you have this being who wants to reveal to his creation in words that are very rudimentary and concepts that are very rudimentary, things that are way beyond their comprehension. Religions then enshrine what they know at that moment in time, and it becomes dogma. And it then prohibits people from moving forward, right? Because they're trapped in a false, rudimentary, elementary, baby understanding of what the texts were revealing. But we tend to throw those babies out with the bathwater, right? And those who want to point out the error and, to your point, prove their way as being right, and put forward the atheist proposition as scientific truth and reality, right? Then these echo chambers get formed on either side, and we're not having a discussion about this. So anyway, I just wanted to interject some of those thoughts. So it's not that the Bible is against studying the stars, right? But it does warn against the enshrined dogma of yesteryear, whether it's religious dogma or scientific dogma that is later proven wrong.
no, those are some good points. and very accurate. And whether it's religion or science, anytime you put forth a position and argue it, yeah, we all as human beings we have a hard time remaining neutral. Are you searching for truth? Are you on a search for truth? And are you prepared to go where the evidence leads you? Or are you putting forth a position and only looking at the evidence that supports the position? What's that? Cognitive dissonance, I believe that's called, where we only look at the evidence that supports our position. So anytime we're putting forth a proposition, we run the risk of losing our neutrality in the argument. And that's on both sides of the equation. You made me think of there was a great American philosopher, 20th century philosopher. You might be aware of Mortimer J. Adler, and he wrote many works. I really respect the man, but he set out, like so many philosophers, he was an atheist, and he set out to prove there's no God. And he said, "I'm going to go," and he said, "Okay, as a philosopher, the only way that we can prove there's a God is if we can find a question to which the only answer is God. If we can find a question to which the only answer is God," I don't know if you're familiar with his journey. He said, "Then there's a God. And I'm going to prove that there is that question doesn't exist. I don't want to spoil the book if anybody wants to read it, but he got a big surprise in his journey. And he found a really interesting question with a really interesting answer. That if I mention the question, everyone will go, "Oh yeah, I've probably heard that question." So I don't know if I want to spoil it. If you want me to spoil it, spoiler alert or not.
Yeah, spoil it.
Completely up to
All
you.
right.
Spoil it.
So he basically said the only way to prove there's a God is if there's a question to which the only answer is God. And he said he came up with the question, why is there something instead of nothing? And and I read that book years ago, and I pondered that question, and it's like, yeah, there's only one answer I'm coming up with. Speaking of the science versus religion thing, 24 years ago, I was in a bookstore. I went into a bookstore. I was working out of town for a few years, and I just decided, I don't know what got me going. I wanted to find a book on the life and times of Jesus. I didn't want a dogmatic book. I didn't want a book on religion. I just wanted to know, what kind of home did they live in? What kind of things would he have done? Where would they eat? What would they do? What was it like, the village? And I stumbled across a book simply entitled Jesus by a gentleman by the name of John Dominic Crossan. And it struck me because I was reading this book, and it was a really revisionist view of Jesus based on the new, whatever they called new wave kind of stuff. And it had no basis in fact. And it was just out there on a limb, like Paul warned Timothy, don't get too far on a limb. He was kind of far on a limb. And that was the day I decided I'm going to read everything I can for and against God, for and against religion, for and against, the God versus religion thing. And I've read numerous books. I've read numerous works by some of the biggest names on both sides of the battle. And so far, and I try and remain neutral, but so far, the atheist side is losing badly in their arguments. I really haven't seen a solid aha moment argument, and they might be in a catch 22, because how do you prove a universal negative, right?
Well, that you've raised a really interesting point that I want to comment on. A verse that came to mind is Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6. Hebrews 11 is known as the faith chapter. And hopefully we can share this quote, but I'll read it. Paul says in Hebrews 11, verse 6, "Without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him." I submit that the question that Mortimer Adler answered for himself is a glass half full, glass half empty kind of question. I don't personally believe that that it would constitute proof, and any nihilist would come to the conclusion that there's nothing. Why is there something rather than nothing? A nihilist would not view the something as positive. right? And would continue to view the existence of something as proof that there is no God, right? He would see it as meaningless. He would look at the negativity. He would look at humans killing each other. And that something that this person would see would be for him proof that there is no God. You follow me? But it's this point of open-mindedness, but none of us can be completely objective. True objectivity does not exist. We all have biases, large or small, that influence, whether we see the glass as half empty or half full. And I would submit that those that would have a positive view of God, whatever that would mean to somebody who doesn't believe in God, right, or is agnostic about God, would end up finding God. And somebody who would, perhaps have a negative view of that would end up not finding God. God is therefore going to be elusive, right? And you're not going to be able to pin God down unless you're sort of looking for God with a positive bias, if that makes sense. What's your thought on that perspective?
Well, that's a lot to take in. I will say this. The first thing is the nihilist or nihilist. I'm not sure on the proper pronunciation, but they're already biased. The fact that you're a nihilist or a nihilist, I'm not sure. Um, that's going to bias your how you approach the issue, and so that takes away a little bit from their position. When I first read that question, why is there something rather than nothing? I laid awake at night for months, and I mean months, and I pondered this and I pondered this, and I keep coming back to, okay, let's say there's no God. Let's take the nihilist position. There's no God. Something just happened to be here forever. Something was always here. It didn't come from anywhere. There's no meaning to universe, but yet all the planets and all the stars and all the rules and laws of our universe that function so on such tight rules, I just have a hard time with it was always here. Either either God created the universe or nothing created the universe, and there's no meaning, but yet everything's here, and yet human beings search meaning in their life. There's you know the more I ponder it, the more I'm moving towards agreement with Dr. Adler. I just can't. It just that's and I try and remain neutral. That's what I do, right? That's my thing. I try and look at the evidence, but I just can't help but go in the direction he went in as well. Uh, I don't know if that helps at all, but
No, it does. I'm slightly distracted by a couple of comments from our viewers here. One of which is uh, that objective reality exists and can be perceived, by Ian. So I'd love to dig into
boy, the
that comment.
postmodernists would have a day with that one.
Right. I'd love to dig into that sometime, and Ian, perhaps we could have you on the show sometime to discuss that idea, and we could dive into it a little bit because it's a very good one. I don't want to go into that particular trough right now or discussion, but you
For
raise
what
a
it's
good
worth,
point
if
that
he's
could be
saying what I
further
think he's
discussed.
saying, for what it's worth, if he's saying what I think he's saying, I agree with him. Um,
So
I just
again,
wanted to
it
add
would
that.
be thank you. It would be an interesting discussion. I want to shift gears. We're going to move towards an article now that recently came out. But before we do, Jill is going to just sort of share a little bit of her thoughts on this. Well, we'll actually go to Jacqueline first and then back to Jill, just to invite both of you the opportunity to provide any comments or thoughts that you've had as Gerry and I have been discussing this.
I'm really enjoying the discussion. I hate to be boring here, but I don't have anything to interject at the moment. I'm enjoying where it goes.
I feel the same. I mean, the only thing I can really add is that when you guys were talking about science and, believing in God, I feel like everybody now is so emotional about their getting their point across. They have to be right. And I feel like society in general has just shifted, and things that people could communicate about before. Even 10 years ago, they can't. They have to be right. And I feel like it's just really divisive. Everything is really divisive now. So that's really all I have to add.
Well, that kind of leads into the word from a sponsor as to, another
Sure.
dimension of what this show is about. There's a comment out there about, I think it's probably directed at me, that I'm seem to be generally misguided as to what science does and also our current cosmology. So, Drowning in Decimals would love to have you also on the show to dig into this a little deeper. Perhaps you and Ian, and we could get into this. I'd love to, invite you to explore a little bit more fully that topic and find out if indeed I am misguided. I could very well be misguided. I hope that I'm open to that scientific inquiry. But Jill, share a little
Sure.
bit that dimension, both in terms of what Gerry's offering on his podcast and what we have to offer in addition to this show.
Sure. So, first of all, Jerry, do you want to just tell everybody how they can find your podcast?
Oh, sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
So the name of the podcast is called The Fact of the Matter, and it's on practically every podcast carrier, Apple, Google, Spotify, podcast. What was the other podcast? Addict. Practically everyone it's on. And there was another show with the same name, although I don't know if they're still active. But mine, I have a yellow icon with a picture of a magnifying glass and a picture of a book, and my little stage name for the podcast, Dry Toast. So yeah, the fact of the matter on practically any podcast carrier. Thank
Great.
you.
Great. So we'd like to just share with you guys a word from our sponsors, Something or Other Publishing. It's one of the sponsors of the show, and they have launched a Unity in Diversity workshop. A core group of individuals from diverse backgrounds and perspectives have been meeting regularly to participate in further developing a workshop format in which participants learn how to openly share contrasting perspectives in a respectful, healthy, and productive manner. I've had an opportunity to be in this university in diversity group, and it's basically a group where, although we have differences of opinions, how can we share that and be productive and be open and not be emotional about not agreeing with what we always want people to agree with? It's a great group, and we're going to take some time. We're going to take these university and diversity workshops to the next level by inviting our guests each week to join us, along with any audience members who would like to explore the wonderful experience of breaking up the echo chambers that are dividing us and leading to negative results throughout society. Just email info@soopllc.com and reference Unity and Diversity Workshop.
Thank you, Jill.
Yeah, no problem.
We had a comment here about positive emotions allowed. I'll just share a quick vignette as we then segue into the next segment here. Positive emotions allowed, exactly. So I was at a workshop once, or a conference once, where a person had written a book about the virtues being the language of emotions, virtues being the language of emotions. And I said, I can't attend your. I happened to sit next to this guy at breakfast. I was also presenting a workshop. We were talking about our workshops, and I said I would love to attend your workshop, but I can't. I have a conflict. I'm giving mine at the same time. Can you give me, over breakfast, the summary of your book? And he said, I can do it, in 30 seconds in between, bites here. I'm like, great. He said, emotions are either evidence of or the absence of a virtue. Emotions are either evidence of or the absence of a virtue. That's a really interesting thought. I actually think it's fairly profound, and I've thought a lot about it, and it's something maybe to ponder on. Emotions being evidence of a virtue or the absence of a virtue. And anyway, moving on then, that might be a little something to keep in the back of our head as we move into the next segment here. So I'd like to share from an article from a website, Religion News Service. This is an article that was written December 1st. The title is Why Americans are leaving their churches. And an author named Stephen Bullivant, who's done research into demographics and sociology, provides his opinion on nonverts, right? Nonverts, people who were converts and who are now nonverts, people leaving religion. Nonverts, the making of ex-Christian America. And the premise of his book, as illustrated by this author, is that unlike Europe, where there's been a slow erosion of religion and people have been leaving religion for many decades. I remember when I was in Europe as a pastor, we had this term, the North European plane of irreligion, right? And yes, I am Swedish, as the name Franson would indicate. I went to school in Sweden, fourth, fifth, and sixth grade. My father's from Sweden, and I ended up in Germany, and I was pastoring churches in Germany and Switzerland, and also behind the Iron Curtain. I was pastor of the first church for our denomination in Estonia. I was in Poland, before the wall came down, doing tons of stuff in Europe. And we were struggling with this concept of the North German plane of irreligion, and trying to advance the cause of religion in some of those countries was very difficult. But what this author is commenting on is how rapid has been the departure of Americans from their religions. And he covers off on three main reasons. First, he says, was the end of the Cold War. It's interesting for me personally because, again, I had those experiences behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War and just as that was ending. And in fact, one of my claims to fame was negotiating with Pol Orbis, in particular, the Polish government-controlled tourist agency, to bring in a group of 100 plus religious people to worship in Poland, an Iron Curtain country where religion was outlawed. This was before the wall came down. Quite a significant achievement that we were able to bring in a group of more than 100 people to worship for 8 days. And also we were working on getting visas from people from different countries behind the Iron Curtain to travel to other countries where they could worship with us, because they weren't allowed to worship even with us in their own countries. So the wall was crumbling in the Soviet Union. Religion was being allowed to creep back in. So it's fascinating now for me to read, and the end of the Cold War was the collapse of religious observance in America. It's the first thing that he mentions. He says there was a big threat of, quote, godless communism, unquote, making it hard for anyone with religious doubts to admit them publicly. There was this coercion, right? Societal coercion to go along and conform, because the alternative was godless communism. Secondly, a second factor is the sudden appearance of the internet, which made it possible for like-minded people to find each other, right? So these people that had their doubts and that were beginning to feel like they didn't need to go along, and they had arguments against this threat of godless communism and other things, could find each other. And the third factor, he says, sounds like circular logic. Quote, the nuns, meaning those who don't have religion, the nuns are rising because the nuns are rising. But human beings are herd creatures. So this is not actually circular logic. It's more of a contagion. You might say a virus, right? Of these people becoming infected and finding each other. Now, it might be a positive thing, right? They might be, building immunity to the false idea that there's a God or that their particular religion is good. But the point is, it's somewhat contagious and people want to be around others. So Bullivant explains we tend to do what our neighbors are doing. That's that social coercion. So this gets to the heart and core of the message of this show. Religion has resorted to means that are not inspiring to corral the sheep over history. And the role of scientific thought and scientific inquiry, as well as some of these societal changes, is now leading to a large rejection of organized religion in particular, and probably, even spiritual God, connectivity amongst Americans. Gerry, you're up in Canada, as we learned earlier, and, perhaps in Canada, this progression away from religion was a little more gradual and has been a little longer lasting. What are your thoughts on this article, both as a Canadian and thinking about and observing that, yeah, this this phenomenon is happening here south of your border.
I think it's probably happening here similar to the United States. Um, this makes me think of a scientific concept that I talk about a bit in my show, the bell curve. And the bell curve explains so much of life and so much of issues of the day, so to speak. But if you look at the bell curve, right, so many people you got on any kind of an issue or any kind of a thing, anything that falls under a distribution. You've got the fringes on the outer edges on the two sides. You've got the mass in the middle, and then the two shoulders. And I think he mentioned that interesting thing about godless communism. There's probably always been like kind of. I think he mentioned it there when I think you read that about there was that group that was always just hanging on, but now it's easier to say I'm not there because I'm not going to be a godless communist or evil or burned at the stake or what have you. So that does make some sense. Although I think it's like anything. I don't think it's a trend. I think it's a fad. And I think I shouldn't say I think the evidence. I try not to think. I try to think. I try and let the evidence lead me. Is what I'm trying to say. I think the evidence will show that it'll balance itself out over time. These kind of things. It's kind of
What
like you
what
ever
what
notice.
what time frame are we talking about here? Because we've not seen that happen in Europe, for example. We're talking since the Enlightenment. And by the way, I lived in Germany and Sweden, as mentioned. I was actually born in Canada for our listeners up there as well. So I've lived in 7 countries, and I've seen this trend increase over my lifetime, but it was proceeding apace in Europe in particular, and of course, even in the Soviet Union, right? Which threw religion out across its territories. They've come back to it, but I think we're seeing an erosion, right? So, what time frame are you referring to? Because he also provides the data. There's a graph which I think I shared with you from 72 to 2018. This man is he's not just coming up with these ideas; he's digging into the data, right? And
I see the
yeah, go ahead.
graph, and I think this is a good graph. And it's kind of where I was just going to go to. I can't answer on time frame, but I would, and maybe you've seen the numbers, but I would think. Well, actually, let me make my point, and then I'll come back to what I was just going to say now. So when you hear a new company comes along, and this company is growing rapidly, and so they try and sell you stock in the company. In 20 years, you're going to be rich. Well, no, every new company that's a success or what have you, there's always that rapid growth phase and then it levels off, right? And so I'm looking at this graph here and I'm thinking it's probably going to level off at some point. I want to ask you though, do you know the numbers in Europe? Surely it hasn't been 500 years of because 500 years of there'd be no one left in religion. And I know there's lots of churches still across Europe. So do you know the numbers? Has it stabilized at a certain percentage?
Well, I think the graph is America, right? And
The graph's America.
right. So, and I wish I had the ability to kind of, well, you know what? I don't know if I can screen share. Let me try to do that real quick. I can do that. It looks like.
But this graph also says with no religious affiliation. So I don't know, a lot of people might not be religiously affiliated, but still believe in God and still believe in a higher power.
Yeah.
It's possible for sure. So this graph is America. And what we see here, 72 to 92, and then you see this dramatic spike. What's interesting is it's showing the similar spike happening for adults and those under 30. And it very much has this point in time, which is the beginning of the internet. I would submit that what this graph shows is that the population of America is beginning to mirror some of the populations in Europe. And as you've said, there still are churches in Europe. There still is religion in Europe. And I don't want to I don't really want to go into the point about quality, right? I don't want to make a qualitative judgment about, what those people believe or how zealous they are or how fervent they are. You know what I mean? Um, so it's probably true to. I think you make a really good point about the bell curve and the distribution, right? That there will continue to be those who will tenaciously cling to religion, but the bulk of society has clearly shifted, and in Europe we've not seen it shift back at all.
Can I disagree with that?
Sure.
You might know the numbers better than me. I haven't, but I thought between Christianity and Islam, I thought we were talking like 5 billion people, which is over half the world population. Does anyone know? Am I off on my numbers? I know it's in the billions between Christianity and Islam. We're in the billions. The numbers. Now that's not very qualitative, right? Some are more into it, less into it. We're not. We're simply. It's kind of like an on-off. I'm just simply saying an on-off. How many? I don't know. Do you know the numbers?
No, I mean, rough numbers were, somewhere around 1 billion for each of those. But that includes, large countries that, are perhaps not experience what this graph showed about the United States.
I just Googled Christianity. How many? And Wikipedia, which is a reasonably good source, says 2.4 billion adherents of Christianity, and I think Islam is not far behind. So, the I don't know. I think this may be the United States, but the world overall. Oh, the numbers are far back in my head. It's been a while since I've seen them, but I think overall religion is fairly stable. Maybe some of the listeners might have time to Google that, but I thought the numbers overall were stable. We're looking at one country over a short period of time, right? So is it representative of the world, I guess?
I do have something to say on this. This isn't based on any sort of stats or anything. This is all very, intellectual graph-based approach to this topic, which is very relevant. But I've just been reflecting my personal life in the last couple of days. And I mean, you could say from some of my work the last 5 years and then in more of my interactions recently, I feel like there's a spiritual and religious revival happening, and maybe that hasn't showed up in the graphs yet. I think that, but I know like a lot of people who were raised very like irreligious or secular, who have found faith. They're young people, like you wouldn't know it by looking at them or what have you, but who have become very devout. And I think it actually coincides with the lack of religiously inspired moral principle guiding the world, guiding the social element of the world. It is in the US and Europe and I guess everywhere, it is no longer like politically correct to use any sort of moral compass to make decisions, it seems like. And the more that decreases the morality in the public sphere, I feel like it's actually drawing people for their own independent search for truth and to search for God and meaning and stuff. So again, that's not based on any facts you can Google, and it could just be the circles that I run in and the people who are attracted to what I do and stuff. But maybe it's a trend that's not showing in the graphs yet, that people seem to be really hungry and searching. So it's not necessarily like staying in the church of their upbringing, but it's finding a devotional practice on their own out of a great need.
I agree with you. I agree with you. I don't think my personal opinion is, I don't know if people necessarily organized religion. I know since I've moved here, I've met many people that are quite religious and believe in God and believe in Jesus, but they don't necessarily subscribe to an organized religion. And maybe it's just the location that I'm at, but I've noticed that here. So more so than before when I wasn't, when I was in a different location.
Yeah, so I appreciate really those thoughts. And I'd like to pose one question as we come to a conclusion here. We're already at the hour. Of course, those who watch the show every week know we always go over. We always try not to, and we always go over, which is great. But so where is this trending then? What does the future hold? Given these trends that we've just talked about, both the graphs, the dominance of religion still globally, at least people who profess and claim, that interesting chart that I think our technical support ran across the screen while Jacqueline was talking, or Jill was talking. Where's this trending? What's next? Will we see that revival continue? Will echo chambers tear the world apart between those who adhere to religion and traditional morality? Will we find some kind of balance? Who wants to go first and just share where are things trending? None of us lay any claim to being prophets, even with the smallest of small p's. But what's your sort of prediction as to where things are going to go in the near future, let's say, not the distant future?
Well, personally, I think that the worse things get in the social sphere of tolerating immorality and dishonesty and cheating of all sorts and corruption of family and all of that stuff. I think that the more blatant that becomes, the worse it gets, the more it's going to draw people together and towards a godly foundation.
I agree. I think it's a pendulum. I feel personally that our pendulum is way on one side right now, as far as morality, and I feel like it's gonna have to go. So the question is where's it gonna go? Right? Is it gonna go way on the other side? Is it gonna come in the center? But I think you're right. I think the harder things get for people, and the more chaos that you have, and sadness and things like that, I think people will start to search.
I think I'm going to say the same thing you ladies said, but I'm going to say it in a more egghead kind of a manner.
Do it.
And I want to start with one of the listeners, Ian, there had mentioned truth will out. It always does. That reminds me of a saying Winston Churchill said, and I'm going to butcher it, and I apologize, Winston. He said something like, he was talking about truth, and he said, malice attacks it, ignorance derides it, but in the end, there it is. And so powerful. And so speaking, as I mentioned, I'm an instructor in ethics. And ethics has been, ever since before the time of Aristotle, ethics has been a study. And it's kind of like ethicists are like economists. If you took all the economists in the world and placed them end to end, they wouldn't reach a conclusion. And ethicists are kind of similar. And we've been, the study of ethics has been revolving around the theories of ethics for thousands of years. There's two main streams of thought. There's consequentialism, where good behavior is based solely upon the consequences. Good consequences, therefore good behavior. There's non-consequentialism, which is more religious codes of ethics, Bible, Quran, Torah, where we have these codes of behavior. And so this has been going through history for thousands of years. And where they're kind of coming at the moment is what they call, consequentialism has no guiding, no North Star. And it leads to a thing you've probably all heard because it's out there right now, relativism, where my truth for me and your truth for you. And there's really no truth then. So we tend to be heading towards there's an answer that we need a guiding North Star, and otherwise ethics is meaningless. So I'm kind of saying the same things you ladies are saying, but more of an egghead theoretical manner. I don't know did I make sense there? Did I explain that well?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And not even dry toast, by the way. Humorous and colorful. So
My humor's
Gerry,
dry.
I didn't actually ask this or find out. Are you a family man? Do you have a family, children, perhaps?
We do. We have three grown children. 30, oh boy, I'm in trouble. 37, 34, and 30. Two boys. The first two are boys, and the youngest is our daughter.
Congratulations.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
grandchildren.
Unfortunately, none yet, but time
Yeah.
will tell. Right?
Well, so the reason I ask in this context is, and this perspective, and Jill and I have talked a lot about this. We're in the process of raising teenagers right now, and it's challenging in ways that, and of course throughout history, right, the older generation has always had this challenge and the younger generation has always had this challenge of, the stream of time is moving and things are progressing, and the old folks don't get what the young folks do, and the old folks think that whatever the young folks do is much more terrible than whatever they did when they were that age. You mentioned when you were 15 you didn't take personal responsibility. Mea culpa, right? My seminal experience was at age 19 up in Alaska with the state troopers in hot pursuit running off the road at 120 miles an hour, and somehow surviving, right? And that was a wake up call. But my point is, as a parent today, we are seeing challenges that, in my view, are far worse than anything before, especially so-called safe spaces in school, and the books that are being, encouraged for children to read, that are excessively sexualizing their thinking at an age that is just completely inappropriate, right? So some of where we come from on this issue of morality has to do with the fact that we have children of that age in a society that is rapidly changing, and society has perhaps, always rapidly changed, especially in the last several hundred years. But what is generally considered moral and what is generally considered a standard fabric of society is changing dramatically. So these are some of the issues that we deal with on the show. But it's been just wonderful, Gerry, to have your perspective here with us tonight. And I really do hope that you've enjoyed it as much as we have, and that we will perhaps be able to have you back on the show at some future time, maybe with Ian and others who want to dive into objectivity versus subjectivity or other topics that we might find that are interesting to us and to the audience. We'll let you have the last word before a final, reminder about clicking, subscribing, and all that. But Gerry, what would you leave the audience with in the wake of all this?
Well, first, I don't want to forget. Let me thank you very much for the pleasure of having me as a guest. Something you just said reminded me of the late great Judge Antonin Scalia, and he's, you mentioned what's going on these days with our children and that, and I try and look at the fact of the matter. I try and look at both sides of everything, the good and the bad and everything, and I'm finding very little redeeming in where that is going, and we have to fight that with every breath in us. But what Judge Scalia said, he said, "I don't attack people; I attack ideas." And they're people at the other end, and they have their beliefs, and so if we're going to attack ideas. At the end of the day,
Amen.
we're all humanity.
Very
Amen.
solid advice. Very solid advice.
Thank you. Since I got the last word.
Great. So thank you, Ian. The battle is eternal, he says. So Jill, or Jacqueline rather, do you want to wrap it up for us today?
Yeah, sure. Well, I just again want to thank everyone for being here and thank our audience for watching. Remember to email Soup Publishing, so that's Soup LLC, info at soopllc.com if you want to be part of those Unity in Diversity workshop groups. So email and reference Unity and Diversity if you want to get information about how to join that. And remember to like and subscribe. It definitely is great for this channel, and we really appreciate it. Both created in the image of God, and bookmark our guest, Gerry Dry Toast, and it's Fact of the Matter, his podcast. And we all look forward to seeing you next week.